Hi, welcome to week 2. Alright, so there's 3 particular things we're going to be looking at, 3 different time periods, 3 different places. All of them are wars before 1900, and then of course a big chunk of this book. We'll be looking at 3 different types of things. We're going to look at some nonfiction prose, we're going to look at some poetry, and we're going to look at a little chunk of a graphic novel. Alright, so some background here on the Japanese invasion of China, just in case you're not familiar with it. So we have Japan, it's a peaceful time, we just basically get done with some bunch of fighting, and we got all these samurai sitting around, and during this time we've got someone who's running Japan, and then we've got the emperor. The man running Japan has his eye on Korea. There's all sorts of theories out there as to why. Some of it is, some people say that it's an obsession for power. Some of it say it's a way for him to open up trade with China, because at this point China's not trading with Japan due to the fact that Japan's not in the tribute system. So there's lots of different possible explanations. But when you have a giant military sitting around doing nothing, and you've just gotten done dealing with a whole bunch of rebellions and infighting and things like that, it does make sense that they would look outside of Japan, especially when there's money and resources and things like that available just across the pond, so to say. Alright, so in Korea at this time, Korea is about halfway through their current dynasty, and maybe a little more confident in themselves than they should have been. Definitely a little more focused on kind of pitting themselves against each other and who's in power and who has the favor of the big guy and all sorts of stuff going on. Don't really take Japan as seriously as they should have. At this time in China, we're nearing the end of the Ming Dynasty. Ming is a big and powerful time, but there's going to be some rebellions going on in China. And again, China not really taking Japan as seriously as they could have at this time. So right now we get this huge buildup of military people, resources, everything in Japan, and not so much in China and Korea, with lots of distractions going on in those countries. Alright, so real quick, just really basic, not going to do it huge justice, but if you want to know more, you can always contact me, research it yourself, whatever you're comfortable with. Alright, so 1592, Japan invades Korea and just moves almost effortlessly through Korea. Doesn't matter how much they're outnumbered in different battles, doesn't matter who's defending, who's got the high ground, pretty much nothing matters. So that leaves the Korean hegemony having to retreat north, retreat north, retreat north, constantly backing away, calling on China for help. At this time, Korea is a tributary of China, so they are calling for help. China also starts to get worried because the only thing separating them from Japan, which is now someone to take seriously since they have over 100,000 soldiers in Korea, the only thing separating them is Korea. So China realizes that if Korea falls, there's nothing to stop Japan from going into China, which many believe was the actual goal here, that Korea was just kind of a passageway into China. So we've got fighting going on. Eventually, Japan can't push any farther. They come to a stop. The Korean naval forces are kind of cutting off supply lines. You've got Chinese military forces coming in and helping bolster some defenses. So there's all sorts of stuff going on. Japan can't really keep expanding, so they kind of come to what's practically trench warfare. China and Korea can't push Japan out. Japan can't push any farther, so they're just kind of stuck. China and Japan enter some peace negotiations. which is kind of interesting that they more or less leave Korea out of the peace negotiations. But uh, anyhow, so that does lead to a stop in the fighting for a little while. Unfortunately, they're not able to come to any kind of peace, so the war happens again. So Japan once again invades, once again sweeps through, once again China comes, helps out, once again stalemate, although this time China is able to push Japan back a bit. Chinese and Korean forces push them back. Japan's still holding on, still keeping their foothold, still holding on to big chunks of land. And then 1598, the man who's basically behind the whole thing, the architect of this invasion, of these wars, dies. The Japanese government says, you know what, let's bring our troops back. We have spent a lot of money, we've spent a lot of lives, we've spent a lot of time on this. We were supposed to sweep through, get into China, all this. It didn't work out like we were promised. Let's just bring our people home. And once they did that, then they negotiated peace, and there you go. So you have the option, this isn't a mandatory reading, but I've pulled some pages from a graphic novel here. Definitely not a graphic novel that's appropriate for class. This was made by someone who definitely did not think about classrooms when he created it. There's nudity, sex, violence, all sorts of things in there that are not appropriate for the classroom. But the artwork is beautiful. It's based on the man's actual writings. It's got pictures, depictions of the ships, of fighting styles, of all sorts of things. So I pulled out some visuals for you to look at, some things to read from that. I would not recommend, buying a class set of this book and going, okay, we're going to read this. But there are definitely parts of it that you could use that could be very useful. And if you're an art teacher or you want to look at how stories are told in maybe an English class, social studies class, whether it's Common Core standards or whatever, it could be a great way to do a comparative analysis of how is this story depicted, things like that. So I wanted to include it even though I have to give you that warning that there's some stuff that's not appropriate in here. All right, China during the Tang and the Song dynasties. We'll look at some poetry from these dynasties. The Song dynasty is a kind of a crazy time at first. China's going through a bit of a warring states period. The Song takes over, but there's still going to be all sorts of rumblings and little fightings here and there, and so there's this kind of constant issue of are things stable? Are things safe? Here, maybe where we are, things are safe, especially if we're in the capital. But out, in those outer lands, things are not as stable. Something that China kind of deals with a lot throughout its history. On top of all that, we've got the Mongols just always overshadowing and then coming and coming and coming until eventually they conquer China. So there is a lot of war going on, a lot of violence, a lot of fear and things like that. But to contrast that, you've also got a lot of stability and a lot of invention and creation. We get woodblock printing, movable type printing. We get this explosion of kind of culture and education happening. Maybe not so much out in kind of the boonies area where it's less stable, but definitely in the bigger cities. The Tang Dynasty, which came before the Song, a lot of great things here. Emperor Empress Wu Zhao, first female ruler of China, pretty much the only one, more or less. That's definitely noteworthy. You've got massive military expansions during this time. If you look at a map, you'll see that they expand kind of northwest, taking out huge chunks of land, conquering different people. They also start different tributary systems and these protectorates where people and chunks of land become part of China without really being part of China. Um, so lots of fighting going on, lots of chances to see battles, and a lot of the people in the government, a lot of people who wrote the poetry had experience with fighting, with battles, with seeing things firsthand, possibly being involved in the fighting. Some people even say that this period in time is kind of the height, the golden age, whatever you want to call it, of Chinese poetry and culture. So you'll see some poetry from both these dynasties. All right, and Japan specifically, 1100s. So we've got some different readings from there. We've got the Genpei War. It's not a very long war, but it's going to have a huge, huge effect on Japan. So we're going to have two different rival clans, both very powerful. One that has a little bit more power right now, the Taira clan. And then we've got a clan that wants more power, Minamoto clan. They're going to clash, the how, the why, the where, the when. If you really want to know all that stuff, by all means, you can send me a message, you can research it. But what happens is at the end result, Minamoto clan goes down, Minamoto clan goes up, they become powerful, we get the new shogun, the Minamoto shogun, we get the start of feudal Japan, we get this samurai culture that we're all more thinking of usually when we think of samurai culture, where we've got lots of weapons, but most people tend to think of the katana as the only weapon. Samurai had spears, bows and arrows, they had clubs to break bones, lots of different things. So, not just swords, keep that in mind. But we've got this class system of the samurai during the feudal era where samurai aren't really allowed to have jobs. They're not really allowed to do anything to make money. Their only job is to basically be soldiers. But when there isn't any war going on, that gets to be a little difficult. And that's when samurai start writing a lot more poetry, doing things like that. But when there is fighting going on with the samurai, we get this adherence to Bushido, this idea of what is honorable, what is right, what is wrong. You get samurai who, they wash their hair and put scented oil in so that if they die in the battlefield and their head's taken as a trophy, that they'll smell nice and be presentable for the person that killed them, that they'll be a good trophy. You get this idea of seppuku, ritualized suicide for honor. You've got all sorts of things going on. So this time period that we think of, we get the samurai culture, it really becomes something more during the feudal Japan era, but a lot of what you're thinking of still exists even before that. If you want to know more, definitely feel free to contact me. You'll see some of the writings, and one of the things that we're going to focus on in one of these writings is, what is the duty? You come across someone, a young boy, who's your enemy in this war. Is it your duty to kill him? And then you've got the pressures of other people coming up. Your backup, your fellow soldiers coming up behind you. They're going to be here any minute. What's right? What's wrong? So that's one of the things we're going to look at. It's not as cut and dry, black and white, as simple of a culture as we sometimes like to think. And that's actually one of the big ideas I'm hoping you're getting out of this is the Japanese soldiers during World War II, Japanese samurai soldiers. It's not that two-dimensional character that we sometimes seem to perpetuate. So, any questions? Like always, just contact me.